No Arab has superiority over a non-Arab, nor does a non-Arab have superiority over an Arab. These are the words of the Prophet Muhammad. Such is his guidance for the Muslim nation in showcasing how Islam isn't a faith gifted exclusively upon the Arabs alone, as if they should be favored by Allah over other peoples, but that indeed such a faith was and is universal, a faith for all peoples. In modern times though, when the word Islam is mentioned, most people immediately and strictly think of Arabs. And the main reason why is because of a phenomenon where two negative stereotypes have become closely associated with each other: Arabs and Islam. Both violent, both primitive, and both misrepresented. But this notion of an intentional badmouthing of a faith and a people isn't the concern of our journey in this video. We want to find out why this historic, inseparable connection between Arabs and Islam is no longer truly applicable. When and how Islam, although starting out as a faith with an overwhelmingly Arab ethnicity, ended up the most diverse yet evenly distributed Abrahamic faith in the 21st century. To properly examine the dilution of Arabs within Islam a long time, a requirement for the exploration of several main causes, that of governance, demographics, and of arabization, is necessary. These factors are fundamental in understanding the various stages of the decline of Arab dominance within Islam. From a governance perspective, at the dawn of Islam in the early 7th century, the faith constituted strictly Arab tribes focused regionally on the western lands of the Arabian Peninsula. The conquests that ensued during the Rashidun Caliphates would see the consolidation of the Arabian Peninsula, as well as subsequent large nations being assimilated into the Muslim Caliphate. Expansions that included the Fertile Crescent, Persia, and the eastern parts of North Africa. Arabs at this point in time were indeed the authority and rulers of these conquered lands. Further on in the same century, the Umayyad Caliphate replaced the Rashidun Caliphate, and expansion continued west all the way to the Iberian Peninsula, and in the east arrived at the territories of the Indus Valley. Within a few generations and by the middle of the 8th century, the Umayyads were replaced with the Abbasids, the last real Arab-led and unified Islamic empire. And during the Abbasid dynasty's reign came the slow yet eventual transition from Arab to non-Arab rule, and the eventual collapse of the single dominant Arab Muslim nation. The Abbasid Caliphate would subsequently split off into many others: the Fatimid, the Ayyubid, and the Mamluks, some of whom were Turks and Kurds in the case of the latter two. And by the beginnings of the 14th century, the Ottoman Empire had taken over. No longer was Arab rule a reality, and gone was the leadership of Arabs as the commanders of the Muslim nation, leading us to the modern era, with the creation of many nation-states, where exists today many more non-Arab heads of Muslim states than there are Arab heads of Muslim states. And when we take this synopsis of Arab rule and apply a data filter of demographics to it, one can discover that Islam's divergence from Arab ethnicity might have happened even earlier. At the outset, Islam's conquests did indeed bring about large new populations under Arab rule, but such exploits didn't witness the forced mass conversions of the vanquished peoples, and hence a sudden shift in Muslim demographics didn't take place. So Arabs as Muslims were still the predominant force in the faith. But eventually, at some point in time, expansion and conversions did overtake the organic growth of Arab Muslims across the Caliphate. And the most likely seismic shift in Muslim demographics came during the Abbasid Caliphate, between the 10th and the 11th century, when peoples in the north and east of the Caliphate, that's Anatolia, Persia, and the Indus Valley, plus peoples in the west, the North African Maghreb, saw their own eruptions in the increased taking on of Islam as a religion, as what was by then, meaning the passing of many generations under Muslim rule, a native and preferred faith. And such a shift in population in the medieval period turned the Muslim nation's ethnicity balance on its head. No longer did Arabs make up the majority of Muslims, but shortly thereafter, Arabs would increasingly become a minority. It's difficult to ascertain the exact dates of this shift, as accurate censuses didn't exist before the Ottoman Empire's 15th century tally of the Muslim world. However, if we look at mathematically calculated historic projections of Muslim population growth from the 7th century till the 10th century, we can fairly accurately project that Muslims increased in number from 7.6 million in the year 700, whom were not necessarily all Arab, but let's just assume they were, to 21 million in the year 1000. That's almost a 300% increase. Whereas the slow but steady average growth rate of global populations during those 3 centuries stood at just under 5% per century. Meaning the 7.6 million Muslims who lived in the beginning of the 8th century would have grown naturally to a figure much closer to 9 million Muslims. That's 9 million Arab Muslims. So what definitely did transpire with the figure of 21 million Muslims in the 11th century was that Arabs by the 9th century barely represented a majority of the Muslim population, because other non-Arab populations had converted over the many generations. And by the 10th century, no longer could the Islamic faithful nation claim that it was Arab any longer. Today, over a millennium later, these figures are much more skewed. Arab Muslims only make up 1 in 5 of all Muslims. Asian Pacific nations, on the other hand, number 3 out of every 5 Muslims. From an absolute value perspective, Arab Muslims number just under 350 million, roughly the size of the United States' population, whereas Muslims globally account for a 1.8 billion population. So, Muslims you might come across around the world would be much more likely to look like this, and this, than they do this. The role of Arabization is the third and most dynamic of reasons for the diminishing numbers of Arab Muslims. Arabization in early Islamic history was indeed a mechanism that many of the conquered peoples resorted to in order to tap into the booming political and economic scenes of the region. Trade, commerce, and law were all Arabic-based, and although vast populations ultimately took on Arab language and aspects of culture, such a process was much slower than the territorial exploits and expansions of the Muslim nation. Propagation of the faith was historically in Arabic and remained so. But at some point, this notion of Arabizing peoples, be it by choice or by force, ceased, due to the fact that such regions were either unaccepting of such a process, or were simply too far away from the Arab hubs of power and commerce, like Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo. And these territories were also fundamentally unattractive destinations for any Arab migration, and hence, the necessity to impose Arab language domination or be open to assimilating any trait of Arab identity superfluous. On the Eastern Front, Arabization stops cold at Persia, inclusive of all the nations to the east, like in the Indus Valley, Southeast Asia, and China, the largest growth segments of Muslim population from the 13th century onwards. So with Arabization ceasing, the growth of Arabs was minimal, purely organic, whereas the expansion of the Muslim believer base through missionary efforts aggressively increased century after another. Who represents the Muslim faith has shifted time after time, and this evolution has yet to see its final chapter. Each era has brought about a shift in who ruled the Muslim nation, who spoke in its name, and who today shapes the majority of the faith. At the very beginning, it was the Arabs. Then came Persians, Turks, and Kurds. After them came the Mughals, then the Ottomans. And today, everyone represents the faith. Yet the faith still has to separate from the stereotype of the Arab. Why is that? The answer is clear. Geopolitical events of the last 2 centuries have boxed in Islam from a religion that was global to one that is focused on the Middle East and even more specifically, the Arabs. A narrative that attempts to position Arabs on the lower rungs of the humanity ladder, and to help do so, associated and inherent in Arabs was the worst Western interpretation and version of Islam, violent and barbaric, foreign and discriminatory. Consequently, any fears or impressions of Arabs were then compounded into full-fledged terror. And maybe that's why the 2 negative stereotypes I mentioned at the outset, that of the Arab and that of Islam, help each other in creating false perceptions of both, constantly feeding off of one another to strengthen such stereotypes. We as Arabs, unfortunately at times, don't help refuting such stereotypes either. As much as this channel is about the Arab and Muslim world, The fact of the matter is that Islam is not an Arab faith, and in truth never was. Arabs were indeed fortunate to count among themselves the seal of all prophets, as well as the first believers of the faith. But within a short period of time, Islam's universal message was simply too large to contain within a small geographical swath of land known as Arabia, or within a small cross-section of global population called Arabs. And to prove this point further is that not even the challenge of a language barrier has stopped its spread, neither in the past nor in the modern era. You see, although Arabic as the mode of transmission is and will always be inherently intertwined with Islam as a faith, being an Arab isn't, and hasn't been, for over a millennium.